Good evening, everyone. My name's Gordon Porter, and I'm the Director of Inclusive Education Canada. And that's a branch of Inclusion Canada. And our mandate is to help and support, develop information about inclusive education in our country, and to try to link together good information about how to make schools inclusive, and to support teachers and parents as they work to do that. Now, tonight's session is focused on a very troubling aspect of school inclusion, and that is the question of partial school attendance, seclusion, restraints, isolation. And these things happen regularly all across the country. We hear about them. We get emails and communication from people in different parts of the country, and it seems to be a constant issue that comes up pretty persistently all over the country. And too often, it's because of something that's broken into the headlines in the news. Like the attention to this, I think, has been considered to be more incidental because of something that happens that's not positive than it has in terms of positive work to develop good practices that diminish this as a point of conflict between families and schools. So tonight we're going to address this issue. We're going to talk about seclusion. We're going to talk about isolation. We're going to talk about timeout. We're going to talk about physical restraints. And we're also going to talk about situations where parents are told to keep their child at home, or to have them go to school late or go home early, or in some cases get phone calls at 11 o'clock in the morning saying, be here within a half hour and take your child home. So we're going to try to get at all of those issues, and hopefully it'll provide a start for a kind of national conversation about them. Depending on how we make out and what the interest is, we could well try to follow up on this in different ways. So we can think about that as we go along. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our three panelists, and then I'm going to introduce the parent who's among us. I'm going to ask Tara, who's the parent in the group, to kind of wave her hand so you know who she is. I'm going to introduce her after I've introduced the other three people. And then I'm going to have a conversation with Tara on her situation. And then our three guest panelists are going to share their thoughts, some ideas from their work, from their research, from their experience. And then we're going to open up for discussion and take your questions, which you'll be able to post through the chat function. And Jeff, who's behind that Inclusion Canada sign, will curate or pull out questions and comments from you to articulate to our panel. So that's the plan. Let's get started. And so let me begin by introducing our three panelists. And I've got a lot of material here on all of them in front of me, but I'm not going to use it all. I ask their forbearance with that. Kelly Lamrock's a fellow that I've known a long time. In fact, I met him when he was a performer, or I became aware of him when he was a performer in a group called the Calithumpians, and my son Tim was a member, and so was Kelly. He was a student and taking part in a summer acting troupe that put on performances in a square in Fredericton every noon hour, if I recall. And now he went to university in Fredericton, became a lawyer, has been a politician. He was elected to the legislature in 2003 and was in opposition for a few years, and then moved into government and was the Minister of Education, Minister of Social Development, Minister of Justice, and Attorney General, and worked on a lot of policies that I'm sure people in this call would be interested in. One is poverty reduction. Another is an education plan called When Kids Come First. He's been chairman of the Council of Ministers of Education of Canada, and he chaired a UNESCO summit on inclusive education in Geneva, Switzerland, when he was the Minister of Education. After leaving politics, he's worked for the Assembly of First Nations of New Brunswick. He did some work in Tunisia on democratic development, and he's been a practicing lawyer until he took up his current position, which is the child and youth advocate. And he's also the senior advocate for the province of New Brunswick. And we're very pleased that he joined us tonight, and look forward to what he's going to share with us in terms of his analysis of this kind of issue. So welcome, Kelly. Our second panelist is Nadine Bartlett, and Nadine's professor at the Faculty of Education, University of Manitoba. She's done research on equity and inclusive education, the social construction of disability. She's worked as a public school educator for 22 years before moving to the university. And she's done a lot of research lately on these topics and has written several articles and book chapters on the topics that we're discussing tonight. Nadine received the Merit Award from the University of Manitoba for her research and scholarship, and she is very highly regarded throughout Canada for her expertise in a number of areas, including restraint, seclusion, and whatnot, policy, those kind of policies. So welcome, Nadine. And our third guest panelist is Leslie Trudell. And Leslie is on the faculty of the University of Winnipeg. And she's currently the Associate Dean. Like Nadine, she spent a number of years in a public school district in Manitoba, and she was responsible for student services and support services to teachers and students with special needs. She did her PhD at the University of Manitoba, as did Nadine, and she currently is teaching, doing research, and leading a number of initiatives in Manitoba that deal with important issues around inclusion. And one of the things that I think is important for tonight's discussion is that Leslie spent a number of years at the district level determining the kind of approaches that teachers use, their relationships with parents on issues like the ones we're talking about tonight, and trying to solve the problems in individual schools that parents and teachers face. So we're really looking forward to her input for all those reasons. All right, so that's our three panelists. Now let me introduce to you Tara English. And Tara lives in a place that many of you, I'm sure you haven't heard of. In fact, many people in New Brunswick probably haven't. I'm one of the people that knows exactly where she lives because I used to work there. And she lives in a place called Lake Edward, New Brunswick. It's very close to New Denmark and to Plasterock and to Grand Falls and to Perth Andover. And if you kind of draw a circle around those places, you'll find Lake Edward somewhere in the middle there. She has 5 children, and she and her husband have had a bit of a struggle with their schooling. I think from what she's told me, they've had good times and they've had challenging times. And tonight we're going to talk about her experience with her son, Jasper, who's 11 years old, soon to be 12, and his situation in school and how these things that we've been talking about for tonight's webinar have affected her, Jasper, and her family. So Tara, you have 5 children. Can you tell us why it's important to you that they be included in their community school and be with their siblings and peers when they get their education? Share some thoughts on that with us, if you would.
Sure, absolutely. In reference to siblings, we have the opportunity of them providing emotional support to each other, as well as a sense of protection and security in this everyday experience. With my 11-year-old Jasper, he does not come home and sit down and say, hey, Mom, this is how my day went, recalling events, people involved, fun, and even fears. So his siblings can fill in those blanks when we parents are sometimes in the dark. And then peers are so crucial to our children. Their interactions in the class, as well as outside the classroom, teach those valuable social skills, the social behaviors from relationships with friends on making and even keeping friends, the group dynamics of classmates. And then we have teammates that they work, learn, and play with together, and even enemies. New to us this year is Jasper being bullied, and his siblings have, stepped up and been involved in that as well.
Okay, like one of the things that I've noted in Nadine's research is that many parents report that they find out what's actually happening to their child at school because they hear it from some other child or some other family. They don't hear it necessarily from the school. When you've had troubling situations that have demanded that you work with the school, have you found that to be the case?
Exactly. Some days, Big Brother will step off the bus and say, Mom, did you get a call about this? I heard this. Then the children actually talk amongst themselves and make us aware of events. We've had community members say, yes, this is happening, but it's the norm, it's accepted. And this is what they're being taught as well.
Okay. So what kind of need or challenge does Jasper have that is causing the school to be challenged in meeting his needs? Can you just talk a little about him as a youngster?
Jasper navigates his day with fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, ADHD, and autism. So this equates to the invisible disability. He presents as his peers, yet the neuro difference is very much there.
How are his communication skills?
He communicates. We're struggling at this moment. His communication is shutting down. He recalls events and maybe 2 weeks later. So we're kind of always trying to crack that code and piece things together for him.
Okay. So what about seclusion rooms and restraints? Have you found that that's been something used with Jasper fairly frequently in school?
Jasper comes from and has been removed from a school where this practice was common. I happened to be in the school one day and witness this practice with my own eyes, which then was that light bulb moment of, this is the context to the bits my children have shared with me. I was able to say, this is what they're talking about. Their statements that were just random bits now had context.
Okay, he was in seclusion or in restraint or both?
Both. It was a practice of children physically being removed from one environment to be placed in the seclusion room. As they were doing so, they would call out to their friends, help me, Jasper. Friends would then intervene and try to help their friend end up in trouble themselves.
So he wasn't free to leave that room. He was forced to stay there.
He was forced to stay there. The incident that I did witness was a child in the room banging on the glass door, yelling and crying to get out, as staff on the outside of the door held the handle shut, pulling it with their weight, keeping that child restrained.
So have there been times when things have gone very well with Jasper in his schooling?
Elementary has been well after he was removed from that location and put in a new one. There was communication, and accommodation. They worked through challenges as they, as they arose. Elementary wasn't struggle free, but it was a positive learning environment for him. He had connection. He felt part of and accepted. Yet we
What about
still,
you? What was your relationship? When things are going well, how are you communicating with or working with the school?
the school would call me. It was an input call. It was to say, this is what has happened today. This is what occurred. This was our solution. And if it was an issue that they didn't solve, we would brainstorm. But every day was a fresh start and a new day.
So what about this business of partial attendance? Has that been part of your experience with Jasper, that, he's either been told to come late and leave early, or not come at all for a while, or you've been called and told to come and pick him up in an hour?
A bit of everything.
You've had all those things happen?
We've had all those. There's an annual pattern of ending the year early. It seems to be after June's data collection is done. Well, it's suggested that Jasper end his year early or do half days, as much as saying, well, he's a bother. We've done our time. He is done. We currently have calls home. Jasper started his grade 6 year in middle school without his one-on-one EA support he'd had, unbeknownst to us. We weren't aware at the time of this new rule of EAs being on a ratio basis. So it started out, the first 2 weeks were the honeymoon phase. Then we went to Jasper wandering from class, Jasper wetting himself at 11 years old. Then it was met with opposition. The calls were coming home daily, starting around 2 p.m. and then to as early as 10 o'clock. He was very frustrated, He was angry all the time. His communication was shutting down. Our one-on-one time is now silent. I drive him to and from school. That was, a valued time. It is now silent.
So you were called to come and take him home in the middle of the day? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I would receive a call. He's dysregulated. He's being aggressive or he's being violent. Come and get him. So I would have to drop everything. Every phone call.
How far away from the school do you live? Like, what was the effect of that on you?
I live 20 minutes away. And at this time, I'm unable to work. My focus is the children now. No employer can have frequent calls throughout the day. I cannot drop everything to go to the school. Jasper has been let go early. We've had 3 suspensions so far due to the escalation of behavior. There's been plans put in place for him to stay home while a new plan is developed. So he has actually been home since last Wednesday, while we wait on a common plan and for everybody to come to the table and come up with another new plan.
So he's out of school because the school's planning for him to be there. And
Yes.
this is November.
Yes.
Let me ask you one final question before we move on here. What would it take for you to have confidence that Jasper could go back to school, be treated appropriately, and that you would be respected and treated appropriately as a parent? What would it take?
Trust and understanding with us adults can be built. That can happen. The trust of our 11-year-old, unfortunately, has to be earned due to his past trauma of restraint and seclusion. Connections have to want to be built. We have searched for outside resources to come in to provide training for all the individuals that is recommended for him. Get that training in place, get resources that are outside of the school to be accepted and at the round table. To have this application of recommendations and suggestions applied to his plan to have him set up for success.
Okay. Have you had to deal with a lot of agencies, or have you had to call the school district headquarters or things like that quite a bit in order to get something happening that you're happy with?
We are constantly searching for resources, for supports, for what is available, what is out there, what can be applied. We've gone as far as, our district. We have gone further before as well. Right now we are working with the school. We're working with Child and Youth. We are working with Inclusion New Brunswick. We are working with the Center of Excellence for his FASD diagnosis and to provide training for everyone working with him.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing, and we may be back with you in a bit, but you can have a cup of coffee or relax a bit and listen while we hear from our other guests tonight. So we're going to start with Kelly Lamrock, and Kelly as a policy person, former Minister of Education, former Minister of Social Services, Minister of Justice. My goodness, he's done it all that has relevance to this topic. So let me just say in introduction that one of the reasons that we jumped on the fact of having Kelly here tonight is that he appeared before a legislative committee a week or two ago and made a strong statement about the fact that when schools have kids engaged in partial attendance, they're actually violating the law and they're not really allowed to do it. And I'm sure he'll share more of what he has to say about that. Over to you, Mr. Lamrock.
Thank you, Mr. Porter. And in fact, why don't we pick it up there? You're right. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to appear in front of a legislative committee, which is developing a strategy for persons with disabilities generally in the province. And I shared some of the preoccupations our office has with how services are provided in New Brunswick and some of the biggest challenges. And it did allow me to make a point that, frankly, we've been noting for some time, and this time it appeared to be in a forum where it was noticed by politicians and the media. There is a right of the student to be receiving, there are two different phrases used in the Act, free school privileges or educational services. Now, those are broad by meaning, but here's how I interpret the Act and why I believe that the law is being broken and why we flag this for New Brunswick's lawmakers and education officials. The Education Act is very clear, and it starts with this principle: children belong in school. And that is the foundational principle of public education. If you meet the age required, being under 21, and you're resident in New Brunswick, then you should be in school. And that to me means very simple question is, when do you receive educational services? If your peers are in school, you're in school. Now, there are two reasons why a student can be excluded, and neither of them permit the practices that we're talking about tonight. One is discipline. Now, school discipline can allow for suspensions. We know that in-school suspensions tend to work better than outside of school suspensions, simply because out-of-school suspensions throw students often out of the one stabilizing or equalizing place in their life that tends to provide help. But at least it can be done there. But discipline has a very particular process. You have to have a clear rule that's been violated. You've got to give notice. The parent has to know exactly why it's being done. There's a right of appeal, and you will know very quickly if that's being done. In most cases,
intent's involved in that too, isn't it?
Well, that's the other part. Not only would you know formulaically if it's being done, because there are forms and processes that have to be followed, but you're exactly right. The reason why schools are not using that in these situations is it would probably violate the Human Rights Act. Discipline should be used when a student is breaching a code of conduct or a rule that it is within their capacity to do. We would not suspend, for example, a 5-year-old for the kind of behavioral standard, not meeting the behavioral standard, expecting of a 16-year-old to be quiet and still. When there's somebody who has a condition that when the disruption flows from a student's condition, discipline isn't appropriate. So that's not really applicable. The only other time a school can remove a student is they can remove them from what is called the common learning environment. And I know you know that very well. Generally, it means a classroom, but if a school, and some do, and have far more inclusive environments of, say, using experiential learning, play-based learning, group learning, the common learning environment is how are your peers learning? If that doesn't work for a student, it can legally be a possibility to say, okay, you can provide what are called alternate services. But the absence of service can't be an alternate service. There would be examples, and we've spelled this out. I use that example. There are times when certainly not only can you meet policy 322, but you can meet the legal and human rights standards that should inform policy 322. No one is saying, for instance, and I think this is unfortunately one of the caricatures of the inclusive education position that are used sometimes to shut down real debate, is someone saying, so you're saying if a student is disrupting a class to the point that no one can learn, we have to carry on. Well, no one's saying that. Just as if there are students who, for example, due to sensory overload or a need for particular individualized attention or the need for a certain kind of pedagogy, if it's established in fact and reason, of course you can provide that kind of intervention outside the common learning environment. That's fine.
But there's a process, right? There's a deliberative process that has to demonstrate significant effort and investment in making accommodations for students who need them.
That's what my office is communicating. And to their credit, education reached out to me and said, well, can we tell schools what you'll be looking for? And writ large, I said, yes. And you could probably, I mean, I'm a lawyer, not an educator, but I think what I would look for in layperson's terms is, one, is there some kind of professional evaluation of the student's needs? Have you shown that you have made an exhaustive search of options to keep the student in the common learning environment, or that it can be provided? And if you've done all that, then the outside experience should, one, be aimed at, I should see a link between the student's need and a direct service provided, and there should be a path back to the regular classroom, and it should be measured every once in a while.
And the fact is, like, I live in New Brunswick too, so I know the requirements, I think, and there's provision in policy 322 in New Brunswick that in fact you can vary the learning environment if you follow that very well set out process that bases it on the child's need, not the convenience of the school or the simple solution to a problem, which is simply to put the child aside somewhere or send them home.
Right. It can't be a strategy of abnegation. It can be a strategy of remediation and assistance. If, for instance, you have a behavioral issue and you pay for private services to address the behavioral issue with the goal of returning the student to participate, that's at least the beginning of a conversation. That can happen. If you are providing individualized tutoring to allow the student to be able to learn in the common learning environment, where I get concerned, and we're seeing this, is we're seeing some parents saying, well, they said if he can make it through a full day, then we'll gradually go back to 2 days at a time, or we'll add a week. Well, what's happened? Well, he never quite makes it. We get 2 or 3 days, and then, well, how long have they been saying you should meet the standard? Oh gosh, it's gone on for 3 or 4 years. Well, at that point, either you have the wrong intervention plan or you have the wrong standard. And if I'm not seeing some kind of meeting to reflect on that, then I'm going to be concerned.
Right. So the whole partial school attendance issue, it would seem from what we hear from parents that it's used very freely and without a whole lot of accountability or even reporting it up and down the chain of responsibility.
Well, that's it. At times when, and I started noting this even as a lawyer in private practices, as you can imagine, some parents who could afford private counsel, my name would come on the list of people who might go, well, maybe he has some insight into the educational system. And what we found was often when I would pull the thread and say, okay, well, why is he outside the classroom? Well, I mean, I would have the right to suspend him as a discipline issue. Okay, can I see those forms? Well, we didn't do it that way. Well, then what is it exactly? Is it, and one thing that bothered me and one reason why it stayed in my mind to investigate when I accepted this appointment as advocate is often if a parent got private counsel, I would write and say, you can't do that. And if I'm prepared to go to court and get an order, you can't do it. Well, magically they would say, well, we don't agree, but they never did it again.
Right.
And what that tells me is we know we would lose in court. If he goes and gets an order, we'll have to do it for everybody. So do it for the parents who can afford private lawyers and hope that no one else.
I think across the country, that's what people we work with have found is that if parents make enough of a fuss about an individual case, then a solution can be found, but they don't change the system in how they treat everybody else. But let me ask, let me just clarify. I want to make sure people understand that your position as child youth advocate is that you're an appointed agent of the legislature of New Brunswick with statutory authority to investigate issues related to children and youth. And that's like, I just want to be clear because across the country, people might not be clear about what that position is.
Versions of me exist in every province in some form or another, often by the same title.
Right.
Only in Ontario and Nova Scotia right now would we not see a child and youth advocate. So
And
I would have.
Do you get
Yes.
many, have you had many complaints around this kind of issue in the last year or two?
We've had a few. After that interview, I can tell you I had emails. We saw a significant number of people who reached out, and I even got emails from people outside New Brunswick saying they had seen it on the wire service and
Right.
and that they felt that somebody was finally saying this, that they felt seen.
Well, I know that groups like Inclusion New Brunswick and Inclusion Manitoba, you know, all over the country, these organizations try to provide support to parents who are encountering these problems. Okay, a final word before we move on to Nadine.
I think maybe the one thing I would say is the reason I would raise this, I think I'll just list them and we can come back to it. There are 3 reasons why this is an issue that's important. And it's invisibility, incentives, and family. 1, when you can simply make a child go away, then they are invisible to their peers and disability is invisible. Secondly, the reason why it is important that services be provided during an exclusion, because then there is an incentive for the people with power to return the child to the classroom. And third, I think this policy of sending kids home, what I have seen is it is tremendously damaging to family units. We already know that to have a child with significant disability can raise greater risks of poverty, of social isolation, of family breakdown, and parental burnout. Sending children home for extended periods of time exacerbates the family inequality that often accompanies disability. And that's why this is a human rights issue. We've seen the Supreme Court say in Jeffrey Moore that if you can't fix it in the classroom, then go find private services. And it's based not on whether or not the district or school has the budget, it's government's capacity to pay. This is straight out ignoring the law. Exactly.
And you know, the other thing that I found with families, it's like Tara said, like if you have kids at school and you know that any given day you could get a phone call. If you're at work and your cell phone goes off at 11:30 and they say, come and get them, be here within 20 minutes or else. I mean, you can't live your life that way. Like it's very, very difficult for parents. And given circumstances, many parents simply give up working, which then has economic effects on families.
It's a privilege to be able to leave work at leisure. Sure, you know, people who do what I do for a living can often do it somewhat. But if you work shift work or if you have an employer that requires your presence, you can't.
Exactly. Okay. Our next panelist has done a lot of research on the policy implications of this whole area. And I've introduced to her. Name's Nadine Bartlett from the University of Manitoba. Nadine, the floor is yours. Tell us what you think about these issues.
Right,
Or what your research has told you.
Well, thanks very much for having me this evening, Gordon. Before I begin, I would first like to acknowledge where I'm located. I'm on Treaty 1, which are the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I want to acknowledge my settler identity on Treaty 1 territories. So thanks for having me. And I think much of what I'm going to speak to tonight is really going to pick up on what Tara shared and some of the stories about her son. And I just wanted to give a little bit of a background on myself and what brought me to really investigating this issue of restraint and seclusion. And Gordon, you mentioned that I worked in schools and I was a teacher for a long time and most recently a student services administrator. And probably in the last 8 years, I was increasingly aware of restraint and seclusion being used with students, primarily with disabilities, and found it troubling, heart-wrenching, quite frankly, disturbing, and led me to strike a working group with some colleagues of mine in similar roles in Manitoba to talk about this issue, get to the bottom of it, and hopefully enact change. And my colleagues were keen. They knew it was an issue too, but to be honest, it was difficult for senior administrators to action anything on the topic. And, you know, in reflecting, I think it was uncomfortable. Actioning it meant you had to admit it was happening. And there was this real reluctance to kind of shine a light on it and talk about it and enact change. And so when I left the school system, joining the university, my role was different. And I felt I had maybe a platform to really investigate this more in a more fulsome way and contribute to some real positive change. And so it brought me to my study that I wanted to just chat about tonight, where I worked and gathered data from Manitoba parents of children with disabilities, asking them, you know, has this happened to your child? And it was an anonymous online survey we conducted in 2019 and analyzed in 2020. And so pre-COVID. And a lot of parents shared really heart-wrenching stories and anecdotes about, you know, what had happened to their child. And many of them, Tara, as you were speaking, were similar to your story that you shared. And so I thought tonight, Gordon, I just touch on a few of those kind of highlights, or actually they're lowlights. So we asked about restraint and what experiences were. And, you know, that's a quote from a parent on the screen there that, you know, children were being held to the ground in prone positions, you know, being physically moved or walked, like Tara said, taken to a seclusion room, so physically restrained kind of en route. And one, you know, real disturbing story was about the use of a mechanical restraint. So actually being strapped to a chair. You know, and these are things that are banned in other settings, even in the United States, who we often don't turn to for advice on, you know, education, have regulations, and prone restraints and are banned. And we know we regulate this in hospitals and other settings, but for some reason, we're not really tracking it, or we weren't in Manitoba, and we're still not in our schools. So those were the primary pieces around restraint that I thought I would mention. And I should also say, some people who are attending tonight might find what I'm saying triggering. And so I hope perhaps, Gordon, through your organization, that there may be supports that people could reach out to if tonight's discussion is in any way triggering for them.
Sure, they can send an email and we'll try to follow up.
Okay. And so in terms of seclusion, we also asked about seclusion spaces. And so we had parents told us that sometimes authority figures would block the door, or similar to what Tara said, hold the door shut. And then we asked for how long, and the duration ranged from, a few minutes to hours. We asked about frequency, and some parents said, this happens every week. And that is sort of a normalized practice. And situations were described where there were spaces like a cinderbox closet, and also doors where the handles had been removed on the inside. And so clearly, not only human rights violations, as Kelly mentioned, but also, fire code and safety violations. Like, what kind of spaces are these? These were the questions that we were posing after reading some of this data. And I should say, this survey that we conducted in Manitoba was, we replicated the one done in British Columbia and Alberta. We adjusted it slightly to fit our context. So regrettably, our data is the same as what those other provinces found as well. And so, just to summarize, at the end of this, we came up with a number of key recommendations. The first issue is that these acts are unauthorized, they're unregulated, and they're unreported. And that's a problem. And so we called for a ministerial directive and standards. Why isn't anyone tracking this? And a real close look at seclusion spaces, actually a provincial audit. We said, like, what is in our schools? There should be some accountability. We need to see what these spaces are like. And, if they're like a closet, then they should be closed. I mean, other provinces like Alberta, there was a call for a complete ban on anything resembling a seclusion space. And then the documentation and reporting. Parents said, like Tara, I found out from another child, an EA that works in the building, or I came upon it myself. And so 24-hour, a minimum of parents being notified within 24 hours, written documentation. 90% of parents told us, even if we were informed, we didn't get anything in writing. And then the fourth recommendation was our concern around practices being normalized. Like, this is a daily practice, not a crisis intervention, which is what it should be, as a last resort when there's a threat to imminent safety, physical safety, and it would be considered a crisis response. And what we saw from parent comments was that these strategies were being put in plans. And in a way that kind of sanctions it, not as a crisis response, but rather as a reaction to behavior, which is a real sticky area, because when it's written down and it's in the plan, it almost gives you license to use it, or there's greater readiness to use it. Whereas a crisis response requires greater transparency, a higher sense of urgency, and a higher sense of accountability. And so we saw that as problematic. And so we talked a lot about that in our more comprehensive report. And then training, of course, for teachers, to look at trauma-informed approaches with a focus on, relationships and connection as opposed to control. And, that needs to be a focus of our teacher training at university, post-secondary, but also in terms of training teachers receive in schools. And so we called on our province in Manitoba to really focus funding and resources to making sure that proactive alternatives are prioritized and that there's sufficient training. And then we also thought, let's take a look at these crisis response programs that we're using. Many of you are probably familiar with NVCI, the Nonviolent Crisis Intervention. Several provinces, PEI, and others actually quote nonviolent crisis intervention in their procedures. Well, what do we know about this training program? It's an American program. The evidence base is limited, and yet we seem to be adopting these physical restraint techniques that are sanctioned within it, kind of just wholeheartedly. And so we called, let's take a look at these. Let's create a mandate and direct provincial directives. And within that, let's look at our crisis response training and find out, are they actually achieving the goals that we want? Are they ensuring that these practices are reduced, if not eliminated? So those were our kind of key recommendations. And I'd like to say they were all implemented. Manitoba did develop a directive on seclusion rooms subsequent to this, and I was part of that consultation. But many of the recommendations that we called for were not included in that policy. There was no audit of seclusion spaces, and certainly no willingness to regulate and enforce any kind of guidelines. It was all kind of devolved to the school divisions. And so that is problematic, I think, for many reasons. It seems to be the goal of ministries to not regulate or enforce. And what we saw from British Columbia when they did a survey in 2013 and called for some guidelines, guidelines were developed but not enforced. They did a subsequent survey in 2017. Very little had changed. There were still practices being used. And so regulation is really key. So those are kind of the key points that I wanted to share tonight. I did notice in the chat there were some questions around seclusion and what each province regulates and says about it. And so I've done some analysis across Canada of what different educational jurisdictions actually say. And so my articles are there. If anyone has a slow Friday evening or weekend, maybe they want to take a look and see. I won't talk about each province, but I will say, because someone was talking about New Brunswick and Kelly is here, there is some conflation or confusion in some policies, particularly in Eastern Canada, around the distinction between timeout and seclusion. They're used interchangeably and in many instances loosely regulated. And maybe we'll talk more about that tonight, but I'll conclude there. And thanks again, Gordon, for the opportunity to share.
That's great. And I wonder if you can type in the chat section, maybe the link to your report. Like I've downloaded it and read it. Maybe if you could put that in, and
Absolutely.
we'll try at the end of this program to pull together the materials from people and put them on our website or put a connection somehow and let it be known about through our social media as well. Thank you, Nadine. That was great.
Thanks very much.
And we'll, another thing, when we get back to the discussion, maybe we'll get a chance to ask Kelly Lamrock about what it takes to get a minister to grab onto an issue like accountability and reporting on something like this, because I think it's pretty much a national situation that ministries say something is a good thing to do, but they don't put in place the measures in order to see if it's actually happening. So thank you. All right, over to Leslie, who's across town. Are you're in different parts of Winnipeg, right?
We are. I'm downtown and Nadine is south, so it's warmer at the University of Manitoba.
Okay, welcome, Leslie, and let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Gordon. Thanks for the kind introduction, and really honored to be here with my fellow panelists this evening. I am also here in Treaty 1 and just wanted to acknowledge that our power is sourced from Treaty 5, which is up north in northern Manitoba. My role in the school system, which is spans about 30 years, dates back from 1987 until 2018, was one that was both in the classroom and also I worked for approximately the last 18 years in school administration. So I was in a number of positions, school vice principal, principal, and spent some time as a consultant working with students with behavioral needs, and ended off my career as an assistant superintendent. And my work is really at the systems level. So I have always had an interest in systems and the structures of systems. And I believe that if systems are set up appropriately and the structure works, then everything within that system will flow better and work well. So that's the theory behind all of it. I have to tell you that most often what I was involved with was working between schools and families. So hearing about what schools were observing in regard to students, and then listening to what families or children and youth were experiencing, and then finding a commonality between those 2 points. And I think back to the words of Marcia Forrest and Jack Pierpoint, who did the PATH work. And they talked about what is positive and possible. And so that I certainly heard quite a bit and wanted to aim toward. But I also heard about what is productive. And certainly school systems want students to be contributing and responsible citizens. And, you know, families want their children to have positive, possible lives. And they also want them to be productive, but they also want them to have quality of life. So there had to be a balance when we were having those discussions. And so for the majority of my career, I focused on what we called appropriate educational programming. So that is an amendment to our Public Schools Act in Manitoba. And basically what I did was ensure that schools and teachers and staff had the resources to realize the programming goals for students. And as part of that, certainly there's a focus in schools on literacy and numeracy, but there was also an important focus in the work that I did on social emotional learning and behavior support and suspensions or other types of exclusion. And there were a variety of non-sanctioned scenarios that happened, I have to tell you, and that became the focus of my work. Mid-career, I did a PhD similar to Nadine, and I was certainly familiar with what the literature had to say about positive school climates and the importance of students being in school. But I also witnessed situations that broke down on a pretty regular basis and caused families and schools to be in disagreement. And this continued to be really problematic from my standpoint, and I struggled with it. So when I retired from the school division and I began my second career as a faculty member at the university, one of my intentions was to conduct research in the area of school attendance and suspensions. But before I get to talk to my research a bit, I wanted to talk a bit about some of my involvement initially when I was working at the university. So I served on a working group, which was a subcommittee of our education minister's attendance and suspension task force. And it was comprised of practitioners from the field who had been involved with students who had not been attending school for one reason or the other. And the function of the group was to review data on school attendance. And this group tried to look at attendance data across school districts. We call them school divisions in Manitoba. But basically what we found was it was really difficult to compare data from one school district to another because every school district basically collects data in different ways. So you were comparing apples to pineapple and bananas. You really couldn't compare one to the other. The other very important contextual issue for me was that Manitoba implemented a 1 in 50-year review of education in response to what they saw as concerns in general with education, and certainly concerns had been brought forward from parents and community at the time. And they stopped short of calling it a royal commission, but essentially the process was the same. And so in universal design thinking, if a system is improved overall, I would certainly think that the needs of individuals would be improved as well. And that was my hope when concerns were brought forward by individuals and groups in response to our Manitoba kindergarten to grade 12 review. I was involved in a couple of submissions to that review from both the professors group, we call ourselves a professors roundtable, and also from the Student Services Administrators group in Manitoba, which was a group that works with students who have additional needs and also with parents and families. And around the same period of time, we had a report released from our own Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth, so similar to the work that Kelly does. And this report was entitled Documenting the Decline, the Dangerous Space Between Good Intentions and Meaningful Interventions. And in that report, it cautioned in reference to a youth who had been suspended 8 times during a school year. And I quote, "When professionals are delivering services to children, those professionals hold an incredible privilege to ensure that services they provide help children build skills that support and protect them as they emerge into adulthood," unquote. And I saw this as a call to action, in my opinion, and it reminded me of situations where students are in entrenched involvement with schools. And I thought of the situation of young Grayson Kahn, and that was featured in the Globe and Mail. And Gordon, you brought up the situation where we often see these referrals in the media. And in this case, we heard about young Grayson from Guelph, Ontario, who was expelled from school due to behavioral disruptions and what was defined as violent behaviors. Now, when I was facilitating a session on inclusion with school superintendents at the time, all of them could identify students in their districts that had similar presentations to young Grayson. But when I proposed the question about how we could be more proactive and collaborative for students who might require intensive supports or tier 3 type supports, there were very difficult conversations that ensued as school district leaders acknowledged the challenges, but also identified barriers and of systems working together to provide the necessary wraparound supports. And it really is necessary wraparound supports that are involved and required in order to resolve some of the challenges that we've talked about here tonight. And of course, the ongoing limitations around financial resources available to them through the district. And as Kelly noted, it's certainly not the district's budget that they're looking at, but it's the entire budget of the province. And we have to consider that when we're looking at resources that are required for students on a human rights basis.
Just on that, Leslie, let me just.
I'm not sure I understand.
Let me ask there. How does what you just said, how can that be used by a parent? Like the local principal, the school district representative say, well, this is what we can do, and we can't do any more. And it's clearly not enough to provide the support needed for success. The fact that we have the kind of law or regulatory situation like you just said, how does the parent get access to that kind of thinking? In essence, it's sort of like the BC Moore case where the Supreme Court said you must provide the supports that are needed to accommodate this child in the school, but schools don't do it. And parents are faced with school principals who sort of raise their hands and say, I don't have what's needed, and don't blame me. And then the district says, well, we've used up all our money for EAs, or like, how does parents cut through that?
Well,
and I don't mean you have the absolute answer, but what do you think about that?
Well, my answer would be is that parents should not have the responsibility to cut through that. That is the responsibility of your school district administrators, right? And so part of it is really having good knowledge of what availability you have in terms of your financial resources. It's about having a team that is able to work well with those financial resources. It is, allocating your educational assistants to your schools so that your students are able to be in their common learning environments, but also sanctioning some resources on the side so that you still are able to provide some of those alternate services that, we referred to earlier in the conversation, definitely after you evaluate the needs and you've exhausted all the possibilities in the regular classroom, that then you turn to those alternate services, which are pricey and do take additional time and energy, but then also moving that child or youth back into the classroom once those alternate services have proven themselves to be somewhat successful and give you some answers on how you can move forward successfully.
But I've had so many parents and in fact principals as well who say, everything I have is already out there. We're using it. And it's October and a new problem surfaces in January. And, principals, how far are principals or directors are supposed to take it up the level of bureaucracy to get more resources? They don't have them in their own budgets. It just seems there's a real gap there between the responsibility and the actual availability of what's needed to serve children well. And the education system, I don't know. I've been in it a long time and we don't seem to have figured that out yet. And parents and families pay the price.
They do. And I believe it comes down to having the relationships and establishing the conversations and having them outside the situation where you are pressed to come up with a plan for a particular child, but actually having those philosophical conversations ahead of time and saying, like I did with the work when we were putting together the path for our superintendents in the province, having the dialogue about, well, what would happen if, and what would happen when, and what would you do? And having those ideas in place prior to, so that you have something in mind when an issue comes to the table. Otherwise, you aren't prepared, right? And you have to be prepared just like you would in any situation with your family. You're going to prepare ahead of time. That's why when you do fire drills in school, there have been no fire deaths for 50 years because we've been doing fire drills and we're prepared. You have to have the drills with your conversations. You have to have the plans in place. That all has to occur ahead of time. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. You have a few more things you want to say, and then we'll open up for general discussion, maybe.
I do, because really the other piece that I haven't talked about is the pandemic. But what happened was that the pandemic hit and it turned everyone's focus to survival, basically. But what it also did was it laid bare some of the challenging situations that occur in classrooms and schools. And so certainly there's been a bird's eye view to what those are, I think more so than there was before the pandemic. And so our own process of this K-12 review commission in Manitoba, it was shelved. But what has happened is that the government has now moved forward. Instead of going through according to legislation or regulation, they're going to more non-regulatory processes like these directives. And so we're moving towards policy directives. And some of Nadine's work has informed policy directives in Manitoba, relating to seclusion, and the government is also considering a policy directive in the area of school suspensions, and they're working on that right now. And so I'm working in tandem with them on that, and I know Nadine did a lot of work with the provincial government here in the province around their directive, although we're not writing those directives for them, but we're certainly contributing some of the evidence-based practice and the research that we're doing. And so my research is currently in process in the province. So I'm working with the Manitoba Teachers Society Council of School Leaders. So I am talking with school principals right now about what they believe about school suspensions. I'm looking at the data around suspensions. I'm looking at, again, like I said, their beliefs. I'm looking at some of their rationale and the supports that they've provided and offered. And my take on this was that we could not successfully create a provincial directive on the topic of school suspensions without first having some type of an environmental scan or a provincial audit on the topic. And I think Nadine mentioned that idea of an audit. I think that's important because we certainly know that principals have the authority to suspend, but we also need to do a deep dive. So I'm doing a mixed method study. Part of it involves an online research survey. And then there's also focus groups that go along with that allow us to cover more information about their experiences and details around their planning and their practices. So I'll be able to share more with you in the coming months, but at this time, I'm right in the middle of the study.
So when you talk about suspension, does that include the kind of thing that we talked about earlier, which is kids with I'll say special needs, but kids who have challenges that lead to behavior challenges and who get sent home from school as a result? Is that included, that kind of thing, within your research that you're calling suspensions?
Yes, I am. Certainly there's an aspect of suspensions that are around discipline for willful behavior, but there's also an aspect around students not having the capacity and being sent home. Part of what the challenge is here in Manitoba is there's no other terminology or no other practice that's defined in legislation which would allow someone to go home temporarily or to do a reset or to maybe step aside for a bit while some planning happened. I mean, I certainly heard from Tara that her son is being asked to remain home for a pretty extensive period of time, but I would like to see that being more temporary and then getting a reset and getting back into school with a new plan and being able to do that. But there is no terminology outside of school suspension. So what happens is that students that don't have that ability to make better decisions are perhaps placed in a similar category as those who are in willful discipline situations, and that's certainly not fair. And that's what we're finding. So definitely also looking at, the types of behaviors for which students are suspending, anything from drug possession, trafficking and use, to bullying, vandalism, physical fights, using weapons, uttering threats. And we're also looking at contextual factors in communities like food insecurity, home environments, housing insecurity, learning challenges, things like poverty, trauma. Those are all coming into play when we're having these conversations. So it's a much more global perspective than what people would think that is involved with the suspension conversation.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. All right, so let's can we put everybody in our group back on the screen, Jeff? And
yep.
First of all, anybody want to just follow up on something that one of your fellow panelists have said? What about you, Kelly? Any particular thing? Let's ask you about how we get ministers to build accountability within their programs. Like, what's your experience with that as a minister? A challenge or not?
It really isn't. I think it's only a challenge in terms of bandwidth. In fact, something I find interesting in the advocate's role is I think the public always sees it as you hold the executive or the government accountable to the legislature. Often we're holding the bureaucracy accountable to the minister. Ministers, especially in the large social departments, have no shortage of demands on their time, but sometimes we'll raise something and it gets attention, not because the minister wanted it to be that way, but because it didn't. People thought they were putting out fires, so to speak, before it got there. A minister can have anything she wants. She just can't have everything she wants. And you need to choose your battles. But one thing I found, whether it's, putting a stop to the quietly bumping educational assistants or support staff for union rules that don't favor the best interests of the kids, or removal of a classroom. If a minister sends a word of stop it, this had better not reach my desk, the system responds.
Okay. Nadine, any comment before we go to maybe some questions? You're muted.
I think she's having difficulty with her system, so I think
Okay.
she wants us to go
All
on
right,
to someone
Tara,
else.
how about you? What, any quick thoughts, Tara, from presenting your situation and then hearing the panelists? A thought or two from you?
It's good to hear that there is discussion and that we are not alone. And hopefully there's a solution in the works.
Well, I think a lot of people are paying attention to the problem. Getting something to happen, that's going to take work and time. Nadine, are you back? Not yet. Okay. All right. So, Jeff, you've been taking a look at questions. I'm noticing we have about 10 or 15 minutes left. I want to make sure that some of the people that have been tuning in, and we have 77 people still with us, which is a pretty good group of people. So any questions that or comments that you think are particularly relevant, Jeff?
I think they're all relevant, actually.
Of course.
There's a couple. There's a couple that I'll read off here if you're good. So Donna, looks like Donna's in the Yukon. Said here in the Yukon, the Department of Education has admitted to inappropriate use of restraints and seclusion for minor behaviors. May 2022. My concern is the impact of trauma, both short and long term, on the victims, the children. Can you suggest, this is open to anyone, can you suggest research on this? So, for example, the impact of restraint and seclusion on children. So maybe Leslie and Nadine and Gordon.
Leslie, Nadine, are you back?
Can you hear me? I think
Yes.
I'm on. Yes. Okay, great. Sorry, but I've had so many technical difficulties. Thanks for that question. And I think there is overwhelming evidence that any kind of restraint or seclusion has long-lasting traumatic effects. And so, going forward, we need to be talking about trauma-informed practice for teachers and understanding that it's not about control, it's about care. And when we take this, a lot of the behaviorist approaches that we've been using about reward, those really only look at the behavior at the surface level, right? They really don't get at the underlying issues that are driving the behavior. And so it requires a very individualized approach, but taking very much a hands-off approach. And we need to look at and value focusing on trauma-informed approaches, but also on regulation, students' regulatory state, and really teaming with our occupational therapists to really get a sense of, what's driving the student's behavior. Often it is sensory dysregulation. And so it's really increasing our teachers' knowledge and understanding of some of those key pieces.
Okay. Anybody else want to make a quick comment on that question before we go to the next one? Kelly, Leslie,
Nope.
Tara?
I just wanted to mention that when I went through the review of literature on school suspensions, it was rife with examples of policies used and created under the guise of school safety, but were unfairly targeting racialized groups and also children with additional needs. And it's also, there's examples, and I would say there's isolated examples in our suspension data, even though our data is all over the place. It is clustered with students from identified socioeconomic groups, children in care, and children with specific diagnoses. And so I just wanted to kind of draw that to the attention. So although there's trauma-informed approaches required, there's also practice that is inducing trauma in identified groups as well.
Right. Okay. Jeff.
There's a series of questions that all kind of relates to the rights of parents and children. I'll group a couple of them together and we'll start there. So an anonymous person asks, what is the policy regarding isolation? should there be a plan on how and when a student should be allowed back with their peers? Referring to my own son, who has been isolated from other students for 4 years with 2-on-1 EA. And then before you go to answering that one of the big issues that parents don't know, that it's not okay for the school to call and say, come and pick up your child. So maybe there's two that can kind of group together.
So Nadine, this question of isolation, and I notice in your work, you point out the fact that you have to differentiate between isolation and timeout, because somebody may choose and voluntarily want to take a break. And I think that's where Kelly earlier was talking about going out of the common, still being in the common learning environment, but maybe not in the classroom. And, I'm sure all of us as adults are occasions when we get up and want to take a break from wherever we are. But there's a difference between that and being in an isolation room where you're enforced, not allowed out. And like one of your examples talking about a kid that was actually strapped into a chair and restrained, like in your report. I don't know whether it was in your slides tonight, but I noticed it in your report. Can you just talk a little bit about the fact that we need to differentiate and not wind them all up together?
Yeah, I think, the question and your comments, Gordon, raised some really important distinctions. And so the question that Jeff first read, I think the parent was talking about sort of exclusion, sort of varying that common learning environment. Their child is educated, it sounds like, in a separate setting. And my research is related to and while I do study that, it's about seclusion. And that's the forcible kind of confinement, being placed in a space, kind of like Tara described her son's situation, where he was banging on a window and he couldn't leave. That's considered seclusion. And in the East Coast of Canada, I'll just say generally in those provinces, there's a lot of talk about timeout as well. And timeout and seclusion, the waters get muddied. And timeout is meant to be a brief behavior management strategy, meaning if I'm teaching in a classroom and I ask a student to return to their desk and sit there because maybe they were being disruptive at the group, it could be timeout. They're not forcibly confined to a space and being denied the right to move.
A lot of timeout could be right in the same classroom.
Right. And there's degrees of it, sort of that would be considered an inclusionary timeout. And then from there, they could be sent into the hallway for a break or to the principal's office, but they're not being secluded and denied the right to leave. And when you're being held in a space, that's when we talk about, that's forcibly being confined. And that's the kind of practice where, we're seeing, that's cruel and unusual treatment, really. And it's an infringement on, if we look at the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, those kinds of practices.
Oh, we just lost her.
Yeah.
Kelly, do you want to just follow up on that a little bit? Like that seems to come in. She just was getting into your bailiwick, I think.
Well, perhaps so. I think you're right. A rights-based approach, there's never going to be something where we can look at exactly what's done, divide by 3 and say we have a violation or not. What we can talk about is what's present there. If a student is having an intervention, even if it is delivered apart from their peers, is it based on evidence? Is it defined by the presence of interventions rather than the absence of a plan? Is it one where there has been a clear look at other more inclusive means? And is there a plan to return the child to the environment or to judge our failure to do so and course correct? If you have
in the interest of the child, not in the interest of the adult.
Yeah, not the convenience of the system. And in particular, and I do want to say often teachers and schools get caught in the crossfire here because, sometimes the principal is responding to the options they may have, and they have 2 options. And I've already had this conversation with a number of teachers and principals saying, you have to understand our office has to point out that it isn't the district's budget, it's the government's capacity to fund. And just because they are responding to two options doesn't mean that we can simply accept it. It's this practice of essentially saying, well, we don't know what to do, so I guess you go home. Well,
Right.
then that's a resource issue.
So Tara, do you see the difference with your son with the term timeout and isolation and seclusion? Or have you felt that there's a difference in the experience you've had with him in schooling? Or has it sort of all been lumped together?
It kind of lumps together. It's interweaved. There's attempt at creating a space within the class, but the recommendations by medical professionals, the support, needing the support that he requires is not applied. We'll create a space, but we don't know how to use it.
Right.
We don't have the resources for one-on-one.
Right.
It starts out unintentional and it builds into practice of
Right.
isolation. It starts with, well, you're having a break in a certain location. And then this is your alternate learning location to confinement and
Right.
a lot of time restraint.
Okay, Jeff.
All right. If a school suspends a child stating they need to reevaluate their needs and make a plan to accommodate them, but need to reach out to the district for support, how long is an appropriate time for the child to be out of school without any contact with the school? When my son was removed, we waited 6 weeks because the district person was not available to meet with the school.
Leslie, you've been a manager. What's your view on that one? Oh, did you just leave us? Sorry about that.
Nadine is back too.
Sorry, I just got a knock on the door, so I just had to answer our security.
So
call.
when you were a district administrator, what about 6 weeks of timeout or?
By legislation in our province, suspensions can be up to 5 days by the school principal, and 6 weeks would be required by would require the involvement of the superintendent.
Well, 6 weeks is 6 weeks is a little long to come up with a plan.
Well, I think that there is more to that situation if you are extending that suspension to a 6 week period. So there would definitely need to be some interim resourcing happening, contact with classroom teacher. There would have to be a plan coming together and some evidence that that plan is coming together over that period of time.
Right. Okay, Jeff. We're running out of time, so I want to get a few more.
All right, we'll get a couple quick ones in here. Can partial plans be utilized if they're strategic in transitioning a student and are short term?
Nadine?
Well, I've certainly, seen that in practice. Even when we start young students in the early years, there's often a staggered start, and there can be some benefits to a slow start. But I think what people are talking about, and a lot of the comments in the chat have revealed what I would characterize as hidden exclusion, meaning that these are ways around documenting the fact that students aren't receiving the education that they need and that they require by sending students home early. Even the practice of our buses sometimes for students with disabilities that pick up at 2:30 and arrive at 9:30. Like, these are practices that need to be challenged and questioned. Or the EA is sick today, keep your child at home. And there's actually an interesting policy in Ontario that allows a principal to send a student home if they view them as a threat, but it's a separate category. It doesn't require documentation as a suspension. So we need to identify these loopholes that are out there. And, policy is often written not necessarily by the people who require the policy. And so I think everyone here needs to have, if you have concerns about this issue, make it a priority and contact your politicians and Let's get rid of these loopholes that have been around for too long, and that disadvantage not only students with disabilities, but also, as Leslie mentioned, other racialized groups as well.
Okay, we're running out of time. Do you have one more, Jeff, and then that's it?
One more quick one then. How can we ensure teachers, EAs, and administrators are all informed on how to approach a child's behavior by looking at what they need and what accommodations can be made rather than how to get the child to be compliant? It's probably a long answer on that one.
That's not such a simple one, but who wants to give it a go at it for 30 seconds? Leslie's
I'll just say that
it
is having those prior discussions, having your philosophical discussions prior to actually encountering real life situations, because as a team, you must know what your response will be. And
So you're talking about district leaders working with principals to come up with the fundamentals of how they're going to deal with some situations before they actually happen with real people, and having those discussions and arriving at some agreed on principles that they're going to follow, principles with a PLE.
Yes.
And access to some kind of early assessment. And
Right.
I think one concern with the absence of the wait time for EduPsych assessments is a significant problem in New Brunswick right now.
Right. Okay, time to wrap up. And I'm going to give everybody just a moment to say anything in conclusion. And Nadine, why don't you start?
Thanks. I hope I don't have another technical issue. My final word would be, I think this is so great that you've organized this national forum, this conversation. I think we need to take national leadership on this. This isn't a provincial or territorial issue. This is a human rights issue. And I think every province and territory doing a separate sort of thing, taking a separate action, is not the best use of our time. So I think we should work together and have a real national voice on this. And I think we can really enact some progressive change if we do that together. Thank you.
Okay, Kelly?
Well, I would pick up on that. In fact, it is an issue that my colleagues and I will be discussing through our national association. And I think the one thing I would wrap up with is I am tremendously skeptical of plans that are defined by the absence of service. Even if the accommodation cannot be done and can be justified, there isn't an excuse for simply saying there's nothing profitable we can do. And you know, the amount of time we have to intervene in a child's life before they become an adult, that's precious time. And I'm really troubled by how comfortable we've become with, well, just put the child on hold because the system's not ready or doesn't have a plan. Well, the child doesn't stop growing and maturing because of that. And I think we have to think of this as an aberration rather than the norm.
Exactly, right. Leslie?
I would just say that if we do develop, or when we do develop a national response on this, that it will be as helpful to systems as it will be to families. And so it goes from both sides. It can't be a one-sided endeavor, and that we must work together, and it will help all of us.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be conflictual between families and people who work in schools. It should be collaborative.
Yep.
Good point. Tara, you started, so we're going to let you have the final word.
What comes to mind is the whole issue of plans and PLPs, and any plan that comes with compliance as the key factor has to be a red flag. There has to be staff that are aware of this. There has to be the ability to speak out, to be on the hierarchy within this closed door.
So when you say that, you mean if the plan is that if Jasper speaks out of turn or gets up and does something physically more than one time a day, then he's going to be sent home.
Yes, there's
That
that
kind
whole
of
practice.
compliance.
Yes, and we will call mom twice,
Right.
and then you will be going home.
And mom's got a half hour. Okay. Well, let's end on a positive note. What do you take positive, Jeff, from monitoring the comments and looking at it from your Inclusion Canada perspective?
Well, I was actually just typing a little message to everybody to thank everybody for being so engaging. Like to have 20, there's actually probably was 27 questions here tonight. Obviously, we didn't get to them all. So what I take from that is people are very engaged in this issue and want to bring about change.
Okay, well, our time really is up, and I want to thank everybody who's on the screen now, the panelists, and I want to tell people who are still with us that I think the interest that's been shown would indicate that we should think very clearly and try to see if we can't have more, maybe less formal and more informal opportunities for people who are interested in this topic to come together. Maybe, you know, instead of being open-ended, it might be 30 people in a session and everybody gets a chance to actually talk. Anyway, there are a number of options, and I think we need to think about them because it's obvious that this topic in this area needs a lot of discussion and a lot of clarification in order to help families and children fare better than too many of them are at this time. So thank you all again. And please note that the meeting will be placed on the Inclusive Education Canada website, and you can refer it to other people, and it'll take a couple of days probably for that to happen. And we appreciate you spending time with us. There were over 70 people still with us up till a couple of moments ago. So thank you so much and good night.